free will versus determinism. Does free will exist?
It seems like events in the universe are necessitated by previous events.
And yet, that seems to contradict, to go against the very powerful subjective impression that we all have.
We have a strong need to think that the way we are and the kind of person we are is somehow a matter of our own creation. That I am what I am because I have, to some degree at least, made myself into the kind of being that I am. This is one reason why we value free will. It gives us the sense that there are more than one pathway into the future that we could go down. If determinism is true, there's only one.
Free will is the foundational philosophy, in a sense.
Our fundamental beliefs about what a human being is rely on what we think about free will.
And it reaches into all different kinds of components and sub-areas of philosophy.
Our entire legal systems and the notion of moral responsibility.
How does physical causality work? How we could be the ultimate creators of our own will.
We have psychological forcing, subliminal advertising. And it's important to recognize these are all threats to our autonomy.
Our ability to make choices could have enormous implications for how we think about human beings.
Do we have free will? And then why do we feel like we do?
We have evolved this human desire to understand.
Free will. For many, these two words encompass what it means to be human, what it means to truly be an individual, to be deserving of your accomplishments, and to accept responsibility for your mistakes. Most of us acknowledge there are some things we cannot control. The genes we inherit, our birthplace, our parents. We recognize that we are shaped by both nature and nurture, yet we may long for a third component, known as choice, to validate the sense of control we have over our lives. However, recent advances in modern science put this notion of control into question. By reading electrical activity in the brain, researchers say they can predict a person's voluntary choices several seconds prior to them being consciously aware of their decisions. And the laws of nature discovered by physicists don't appear to allow any exception for human action. So is free will real, imagined, or just a useful human construction? Great minds from the past have attempted to reconcile both the apparent truth of cause and effect and the desire to be in control of one's own actions. But can modern developments in science and philosophy provide a definitive answer to this age-old problem? With such powerful consequences on our notions of identity, morality, and law, this is an issue humanity cannot afford to get wrong.
Do we have free will? That's a tricky question.
I used to ask myself this question.
That is a fundamental question. It shapes your worldview in many ways.
We pretty much have free will if you look at it. Absolutely not.
Yeah, I think we do, yeah.
I don't think we have free will.
I hope so. It's quite an interesting question, really. It's a very complex question.
The concept of free will is very important for us because we make sense of our lives by assuming that we are agents. That is, that we make decisions, that we make choices. What makes my life meaningful is, in fact, a series of choices that I make. Who to hang out with, what kind of career to start, what to do today as opposed to tomorrow, and so on and so forth. So we make sense of what we do of our lives as a kind of a narrative of our actions and our decisions.
So what makes us special, what makes us different from machines, for example, or robots that we might imagine, is that we, under some particular circumstances, when we perform actions, could have refrained from performing them. So suppose we have Joe. He wants to maximize his wealth, and he believes that by evading taxes, he can maximize his wealth. So he's got reasons for doing this. But he's got countervailing reasons as well. After all, he thinks he might be caught. And he also has some desire to do the right thing. Now suppose the net force of these reasons puts him in a quandary about whether to evade taxes. He's torn. Do I evade taxes or do I not evade taxes? What's going to settle how he acts? In these torn decision situations, say Joe's situation, in which he's torn between doing the right thing for moral reasons or doing the wrong thing for self-interested reasons. Now, intuitively, we think, like, how does the settling happen? Well, Joe settles. Joe as agent, right? It's not his desires or beliefs that settle how the decision's going to go. Rather, it's Joe himself.
Was something I decided to do internally generated, or was it due to some external influence? And we're pretty good at being able to sort of judge that. And to the extent that we think it was internally generated, or we have the feeling that it was coming from within, we attribute that to this idea that we have free will. We freely chose that. We had agency. But that feeling itself could be an illusion.
If someone asks, do you have free will? The first thought is, okay, well, what's free will? Well, I don't know. I hadn't thought about it. I just took it for granted. But as soon as you start thinking about it, you suddenly realize, my God, I haven't thought about this before. What about this? What about that? What do I really mean by free will?
The definition of free will is very important because this tends to be a debate that actually does hinge a lot on semantics. Semantics are important. Semantics are about meaning. If we don't actually understand and agree on what we're talking about, then we're not actually going to talk about anything meaningful.
The problem with the term free will is that it means so many different things to so many different people.
The cardinal sin when debating free will, in my view, is to be talking past one another because we're operating on different definitions of free will.
And because there are so many notions of free will in the debate, it's important for participants in the debate to settle on a single notion.
The problem with free will is that the term itself is loaded because, of course, of that word free in front of it. Free of what?
Most people don't have a definition of free will, and the reason for that is because they haven't thought about it.
It's a tough question, right? For me, I would say it's more of like legal consequences.
Less people, they are telling you what to do.
It's the ability to choose the clothes I want to wear, the religion that I want to have, the place I want to live.
I think we have free will, but nobody's really free. We just want to get to the next check or feed our family or whatever we have to do because we have to do that.
They're thinking of freedom in a political sense or an economic sense, which are totally different concepts. I can't buy $1 billion home, so in what sense am I free to do that, right? That's one sense of free, but that doesn't say anything about the causes of my behavior at the level of physics. That doesn't say anything about determinism or compatibilism.
When you ask what is free will, the first thing I like to make clear to people is we need to distinguish between freedom of action and freedom of will. We are free to act whenever there are no constraints out there in the world preventing us from acting. Someone holding us down, someone coercing us, someone constraining us, or maybe we're compulsive, or other things are preventing us from doing it. Freedom of will is a deeper thing than that, and my account of it. It is the freedom to create the will you express in action. We could be expressing a will we already had all the time, but where did it come from? To what extent was it my own creation, and to what extent was it the creation of the world around me? Fate, physics, biology, upbringing.
When you're born, you're a package of genes that have built a body, and you didn't choose a single one of those genes. You don't choose your environment because, at least I don't remember choosing to be born in the household that I did. There was no multiple choice quiz behind like John Rawls's veil of ignorance where you just choose, right? It's just, you just end up where you are. and you chose none of it.
I think the average person on the street believes that it's not the result of their past, their upbringing, their brain chemistry, antecedent conditions that existed prior to their being born. From my own personal, subjective, inner perspective on my actions, I feel like my deliberations are up to me. I feel like my choice is up to me. I feel like I could have deliberated differently. I could have chosen differently.
When I make a choice, it feels like I have this sort of transcendent ability to be above and to make a choice other than what I could have made. So we all feel that way.
And it is intuitive for us to think that, well, I'm free to make my decisions. I could have done otherwise in a particular circumstance or another. And therefore, if you actually talk to them in terms of, do you think you have free will? It's like, yeah, sure, I do.
So how do we define the term free will?
The historical philosophical debate features several distinct notions of free will. Perhaps the most common one is the ability to act and to refrain. So suppose one's in certain circumstances. If under those circumstances one is able to perform an action and able to refrain from performing that action, one has free will. Yet another notion of free will is the ability to act in accordance with good reasons. One issue for that notion is that it doesn't divide the participants in the debate, because everybody believes that we're reasons responsive.
What we want here with free will is, at some points, there's more than one pathway, and we can choose either one.
The most important definition of free will is the could have done otherwise definition, and that's the kind of free will that most people think they have.
The ability to do otherwise.
But a lot of my compatibilist friends disagree.
One of the central mistakes in thinking about the question of whether I could have done otherwise is in thinking that the question is properly addressed if we ask, in exactly the same circumstances, if we could rewind the tape of history, would we do the same thing? That is, in fact, of no interest at all.
So who's right in these definitions? Well, I don't think that's a right question. I don't think we can ask who's right or wrong, because anybody can define any word any way they want. The more relevant question is, whose definition of free will is more appropriate?
There's lots of ways of defining free will where we don't have it, and who cares? Because they're just not interesting, important. They're not morally important ideas.
And the single notion that most participants in the debate have settled on over the last quarter century or so is the control and action required for moral responsibility. So one has free will if one has the control and action required for moral responsibility for that action.
Free will is what you have when you're a morally responsible agent.
Now there's an added complication here, and that's that there are different senses of moral responsibility, and one wants a notion of free will that actually divides the participants in the debate. So the notion of moral responsibility that does the trick here is a notion of moral responsibility that involves deserved blame and praise, perhaps deserved reward and punishment.
By defining free will in terms of moral responsibility, we highlight the central philosophical and practical importance of the problem of free will. We tie it to real, tangible components of our lives, like our interpersonal interactions, like our moral responsibility practices, and social policies like legal punishment and retribution.
Hence, one has free will on this definition if one has the control and action required for desert involving moral responsibility.
Historically, I would argue this is the kind of free will that has been of central philosophical and practical importance in the debate. To define free will removed of its connection to moral responsibility, I think would be to leave out a centrally important component of the free will debate. It would also remove, to a large extent, all of its practical relevance.
If you can't make choices, then you have no right to judge anybody morally. If there's no choice, then there can be no moral judgment, positive or negative.
The history of the debate has been labeled determinism versus free will.
Is freedom compatible with determinism or not?
So if you go back to the time of Spinoza, the main threat to free will, as it was conceived in the debate at that time, was considered to be determinism. The idea that all of our actions are causally determined by factors beyond our control.
And if that's the case, we can backtrack causality all the way back to before you're even born.
Determinism is the view that you could not have done otherwise than what you did, that your behaviors are subject to the laws of physics. You don't have any agency in what you did. What you do is determined solely by the laws of physics. And if you think you could have chosen otherwise, you're mistaken.
If you were to repeat the universe to that exact same moment, you would have no choice because of your traits and your instincts and your desires and your history.
No matter what, everywhere in life at all times, one pathway is the only one possible, and every other one is causally impossible. That's hard for me to buy.
When we act, when we make decisions, this is often the case that it seems evident to us that we could have acted otherwise. For example, suppose you're at the ice cream counter, you've got the choice between chocolate and vanilla. It seems to you, under those circumstances, as if you've got the power to decide for chocolate and the power to decide for vanilla. There don't seem to be any factors that prevent you from performing either action, from making either decision.
The Sarkissian study surveyed 4 countries, the US, Hong Kong, India, and Colombia, and they surveyed people asking them, do we live in a universe in which decision-making is truly free? And I think it was between 65 and 85% of people in all those 4 areas said, yes, we do. So that showed that most people, conceived of us as agents that do have free will in the libertarian sense. And the second question they asked him, well, if we live in a world in which everything is purely determined and you don't have any agency, are people morally responsible for their actions? And again, like 60 to 80% of the people said no. So clearly, the notion of moral responsibility has something to do with free will.
If our choices were undetermined, that would mean, in effect, that given exactly the same paths leading up to a choice, the same desires, the same beliefs, the same reasoning, everything else the same. If it was undetermined, we might make either choice, and there wouldn't be an explanation for why we made one rather than the other, because everything was, in our past, was exactly the same up to that particular point. But the laws had better not be deterministic, okay? And if they should turn out to be determined, then that would be sad.
Quantum mechanics, on the traditional Copenhagen interpretation, posits real metaphysical indeterminacy at the very lowest level of the universe.
Libertarians often cite this claim about quantum mechanics as a reason for believing their view.
Einstein made his famous quip, God does not play dice with the universe. He used that metaphor to say, how can it all just be random and chaotic?
Einstein himself believed the universe was deterministic, that agents lacked free will.
So he believed that it can't be the case that quantum mechanics is really indeterministic.
And Bohr at some point apparently answered that he wished that Einstein would stop telling God what to do and what not to do, and just accept that things are that way.
It's one of the embarrassing facts about modern theoretical physics that we don't actually know whether the laws of physics in the real world are deterministic or not. We teach that it is not. So what we teach people is that when you observe, when you make a measurement of a quantum system, the best you can do is predict the probability of getting certain measurement outcomes. The actual outcome is not determined by anything. But we haven't specified exactly what it means to do a measurement. This is called the measurement problem of quantum mechanics. We don't know what it means to do a measurement. We don't know what it means to say that a particle, a wave function, a quantum system suddenly collapses in some probabilistic way.
Ever since the pre-Socratics, we've had the problem of free will.
The ancient Greeks certainly had interesting ideas about it. The two major schools there were the Epicureans and the Stoics. The Epicureans thought that reality is just a bunch of atoms, bumping into each other in the void.
And the Greeks knew enough to already worry that if these atoms followed the deterministic laws of nature, how could there be free will?
And then they introduced a particular concept that was supposed to account for free will.
The atomist Democritus thought that if determinism was true, then there had to be these random swerves of the atoms, and then Lucretius picked up the idea of the clinamen, or random swerve, and without that, there was no free will.
But very quickly, people worried that the Lucretian swerve was not going to preserve free will any more than a deterministic view, because random swerving of atoms seems no more in the control of agents than deterministic atoms falling in straight lines due to the laws of nature.
The swerve of the atoms, that would just be chance. How could free will just be chance? And that was really the essence of the debate that has gone on ever since.
The Lucretian swerve and the problem of free will.
In response to the problem of free will, three main philosophical camps have differentiated themselves: libertarians, compatibilists, and free will skeptics. What do each of these camps say about free will, and how do they approach the problem? What is free will in the libertarian sense? How does one try to reconcile free will with determinism's ostensible erosion of freedom? And if there is no free will, what happens to morality and the practical need to hold people accountable for their actions? To answer these questions, we will explore each camp, beginning with libertarian free will.
My definition is taken from philosopher Ayn Rand, which is the choice to think or not to think, which means to raise your level of mental focus above the level of sense perception, which we share with animals, to the level of conceptual understanding. So an example would be reading a page of a book. Perceptually, you can see the marks on the paper. That's sense perception. Free will would require you to focus on what the words mean. And if you don't choose to focus, you'll get to the bottom of the page and say to yourself, I have no idea what I just read. So free will is primarily about choosing to think. I think everyone in a certain way knows this, but they can't always put it into words.
My own technical definition of free will, I define it as this. It's the ability to make or create choices without being influenced by any forces or influences outside of your will. That's my technical definition of free will. It's an ability that we have. It's an ability.
I'd put it in a different way. I'd say free will is self-evident. A lot of people sort of think they have it, but they don't understand quite what it is, because they think free will is direct freedom of action, which I think is a little bit jumping the gun. Freedom of action is indirect, because it's based on what your thinking process involves and what stored things you've put in your mind.
It's fundamental, as far as I'm concerned. Free will is fundamental to the human condition and understanding it and why the human condition has the problems that it has, both on a grand scale and also on a personal scale, on an individual scale. The scientific research shows, as a matter of fact, there are 2 studies that were done at the University of Minnesota and at the University of British Columbia that show that if a person doesn't believe in free will, they tend to be less ethical. So, in terms of society, it has major ramifications.
You didn't have free will, it would mean you didn't have the conceptual faculty. Think about chimpanzees. In 6 million years, they haven't progressed in the least. So if we didn't have free will, we would be to the level of the lower animals who live day to day based on gifts of nature, and if the nature doesn't work, you die. So human civilization would never have been created. So we'd be nothing.
I think the average person believes that they possess a kind of libertarian conception of free will. It's a conception that says that individuals have the ability to act otherwise, that the ultimate source of the action is the individual, and that it's a kind of counter-causal sense of free will which maintains that if you were to relive that moment in the past, you could have chosen differently.
Libertarianism is the view that freedom is not compatible with determinism and that we have freedom.
That is, if you went back in a moment of time where you made a decision and every atom, every particle in the universe were arranged in the same configuration, at that moment you made a decision, you could have made a decision different from the one that you did.
The sense that I'm the prime mover of my actions. I am causing my actions, and there are no prior causes that are causing me to cause those actions that I'm not in control of.
And historically, that term has been used mostly within the Christian theological tradition, particularly during the Middle Ages. And free means free from causal interaction. So sometimes that's referred to as contra-causal free will. But for most modern philosophers and scientists, that's an oxymoron. There's nothing that is contra-causal. There's nothing that is not actually caused by something else. And so right there, it's loaded, because when you start saying, well, can we have free will within a causal universe? And well, by definition, you cannot. If by free, you mean, in fact, contra-causal.
I think a big problem is the belief among many scientists that all causality is mechanical, because if you look at the history of the world and the discoveries outside of the human mind, of course, we're learning about the universe being made of atoms and molecules and electricity and chemicals, all of which is correct. So I go this far. Free will and consciousness requires a physical brain, absolutely requires it. But consciousness at the conceptual level is not the same thing as a brain. And there's 2 ways to explain this. One, if a surgeon opens your brain and checks up your neurons, he doesn't come across ideas. That's one problem with that. Should be able to. He should be able to see them. The second aspect of that is that ideas and objects have different attributes. So, physical object has space, weight, color, mass. Okay, we know that from physics. But an idea has none of those qualities. We have irrationality, contradictions, self-doubt, belief. We have hypotheses. Now, of course, your brain's involved in this, but the attributes of ideas are not the same. So that's why I say consciousness is an emergent property which depends on the brain. It's not the same. So it's not mystical, it's natural, but you can't say it's the same thing.
So my personal belief is free will, from the Jewish perspective, has to be non-physical. Why? I mean, I agree with the scientists that in the physical world, there's no free will. There's no free. Physical things aren't free. Everything physical is governed by the laws of physics and chemistry, and God created those laws, and they're fixed laws. They don't change. So there's no freedom in that, right? So if there is free will, it has to be non-physical.
The research I do in neuroscience is mostly trying to understand the neural basis of impulsive and compulsive behaviors, especially how they map out onto different psychiatric illnesses like obsessive compulsive disorder or various impulse control disorders. And then also to come up with some novel treatments to these impulse control or compulsive disorders. So I think the majority of neuroscientists are materialists. It's just inherent in the nature of what we study. I mean, I became a neuroscientist because I wanted to understand where my thoughts come from. And in a way, I wanted to achieve immortality because I wanted to keep my thoughts or my consciousness even if I didn't have a brain. And I was like, is that possible? And so that began my quest of trying to understand how the physical substrate of the brain is connected to our subjective awareness. And the further you sort of investigate and do research, you see that it's very intimately connected. Without neural activation, we don't have conscious experience. And so the research overwhelmingly suggests that this concept of a soul, at least in the fact of us having a conscious awareness, if you want to call that a soul, is tied to this material, is to activation of the brain. Now, if you define the soul in a different way, maybe it's just sort of a life force or an energy, or maybe you can come up with a rationale for how that exists. But the overwhelming majority of people who study the brain see that it's intimately tied to our thoughts or feelings or behavior, and without the brain, you don't have those things.
Dualism, like everything else, comes in varieties, okay? There's substance dualism, which says that there's physical stuff and non-physical stuff. The non-physical stuff typically is mental or spiritual stuff. I think that that's very, very hard to accept these days, but, the majority of human beings on Earth do accept it, so what do I know? What I know is it seems to be incompatible with the laws of physics as we currently understand it. There's a much smaller set of people who are property dualists, who accept that physical stuff always obeys the laws of physics, but in addition to its physical properties, that stuff also has mental properties. This is what a panpsychist would believe, for example. I personally see no benefit to that. I see no real coherent way to make it work, but those people do exist.
Materialism is everything's material, so only mechanical causality. Then idealism is the opposite of that. There are no entities, it's all ideas. So there's only consciousness. Then there's dualism. Now, I'm not totally opposed to the word dualism, but dualism was always associated with religion, and I'm not religious. So it was like the soul is a magical entity which survives your death and wanders around space. So I don't like that word. So I like the term emergence, which means an emergent capacity is an outgrowth of the existence of a rational mind. I don't have a full theory about the mind and relations, but I do feel that reality, even physical reality, the physical world and so on, comes in layers, so to speak. So it's not all reducible to elementary particles and their motions at all. And as you move up to more and more complexity, you get more and more sophisticated things in the world, all the way up to our mental selves. So that's the way I see relation of mind to body. I believe that agents conceived in this way, the notion of agency is not reducible to mere physical events and causes and whatever. So it's a non-reducibility theory, and it's a hierarchical theory of complexity. That's sometimes in the literature called complexity theory. But it's not dualist in any strong sense.
I think the most important feature about free will is it's something that should matter. So the idea of free will that I think is most important is the one that grounds moral responsibility. Some of us have it, most of us have it, some don't. Small children don't have it, the senile, the brain damaged. Other people may lack basic moral competence, and that's completely compatible with determinism and with everything we know about the brain.
The compatibilist position is tricky, although it is in fact the most frequently adopted position among modern philosophers. And that's the idea that yes, we do live in a deterministic universe, as far as we know, because there's some debate actually about that. But in fact, that doesn't deny the notion that we have free will, in the specific sense of non-contra causal free will, in the specific sense of volition. We do make decisions. And those decisions are ours in an interesting sense of being our decisions. Just because they're influenced and maybe even determined by causal factors, it doesn't mean that they're not our decisions. If part of those causal factors come from the internal machinery of the human mind, then that's my decision, if I am the one who is making that decision.
One of the interesting things about free will as I define it is that you can lose it, and you can have it taken away from you by other agents who manipulate you. And so it's important that free will is something you have to protect, and you should want to.
So here you have determinism on one side, and here you have libertarian free will on the other. And most philosophers, by many studies that have been done, fall in the middle. They would be called compatibilists. They think, yes, confronted with the reality that we live in a completely deterministic universe, everything is basically preordained and we can't violate free will, and yet we tend to live our lives as if we do have free will, and we base our social expectations, we base our laws, we base many policies, we base moral judgments on the assumption that we have free will. So most of the people who do that, who juggle both sides at once, would be called compatibilists.
I think that the essence of compatibilism is some kind of causal structure to the universe in general, of course, and in particular to the human organism, right? So how that particular structure, causal structure, is cashed out, it's not really particularly relevant. It could be in a variety of ways. That's why I talk about determinism versus random events is actually a red herring. You have compatibilism anytime you assume that there is a causal structure, a causal web to how the world works, and in particular to how human beings work. And to do without that would seem to me that you would have essentially to do without science. In a sense, science is precisely the job of figuring out the structure of the cause, of the web of cause and effect, and separate it from things that are actually not causally connected.
I'm a compatibilist. I think free will is compatible with determinism. When I talk about free will, I'm a practical real-life philosopher, so I think everything has to relate to the real world that affects people in the real world, not the ivory tower debates and stuff that are disconnected from real issues. So for example, when I'm talking about free will, I'm looking at like, what does it mean in courts of law? What does it mean in medical ethics decisions? What does it mean when we're asking about people's consent to things, where we're talking about their autonomy? Like, were they able to consent to something, or were they acting of their free will, or were they not? What do we mean by that? In practical life, what we mean is people don't want someone else making decisions for them. People don't want their decisions being blocked by someone else. They want to be able to make the decisions they're making and not be interfered with. And so that's actually more of a human rights issue, right? And so if you look at that, it's not something that people want to be free of all causation. It's that they want to be free of certain causes that would interfere with their will. It would allow them to make their own decision. And so people are acting with free will as long as they get to deliberate and think about and analyze and evaluate what decision they're making and get to make the decision they want to make. And it's not a question of being free of all those causes. It's a question of actually being caused by you. Like, so you are the one causing the action and not someone else or something else that's interfering and intervening. And who are you? Like, what you mean when you say you are the cause of a thing, you are a collection of knowledge, memories, skills, reasoning skills, virtues, values, preferences, and all that stuff. All of that stuff is you. And if you subtract all that stuff, you take it away, there's nothing left that is you.
Compatibilists are trying to have their free will and eat it too. The most common version is you're free to act on your desires. Okay, then where do your desires come from? Oops, I'm not sure about that. That must be determined by something else. You can't suddenly say act on your desires, but your desires control you, except for the fact that you can resist them or act on them. Where do the desires come from? Another version of compatibilism is it's responsiveness to reason. Well, okay, but what makes you responsive to reason? Something else outside you. Whereas my view, for Ayn Rand, is reason is a choice that you make. It's up to you. So I think compatibilism, which is trying to have your cake and eat it too, can't work.
There are other definitions of free will, such as that when you make a choice, it was completely uncaused by the physical events occurring going back to the Big Bang. That's a preposterous idea, and the reason that people make that mistake, I think, is they're confusing two very important notions, causation and control. Control and causation are two different things. Some things are self-controlled. An autonomous car is to some degree self-controlled. Other things are remote-controlled, like that drone that I control by running the little gadget. And some things are out of control. Nothing is controlling them. That doesn't mean they're not being caused to move. It means that the causes are as good as random. A leaf falling out of a tree is not being controlled by the wind. It's not being controlled. It's just out of control. The important idea of free will is that we are fairly autonomous beings and we're capable of self-control. And that is not so much a philosophical idea. In a way, it's an engineering idea. It's a clearly defined idea. What is in control of this entity with these degrees of freedom? And if we understand free will in those terms, then I think we can make sense of why moral responsibility depends upon freedom, and why freedom, in this important sense, has nothing to do with the physics of causation in the brain. It might have, but in fact, the physics of causation in the brain is just what you would hope it to be for a brain to have free will.
For me, free will is the illusion that we have the ability to do otherwise. We don't actually have that ability, but we have this illusion. And I think the illusion is not only very useful, but I think it's a beautiful illusion, and it's a part of who we are as social human beings. And I realized, after thinking about it a lot, that you can only be a compatibilist if you think the two sides are at the same playing level, like playing a game of tug of war. There would be one side and another. But thinking about it more, I realized they can't be compatible or incompatible. So it'd be like asking, is melody compatible with harmony? Well, maybe yes, maybe no, who cares? That's not important. I would say it's acompatible. You have two different axes. You have melody going this way across time. Here's a note, here's a note, here's a note, kind of like cause and effect in science. But if you flip it this way, you have harmony. Harmony is not an individual note, it's a stack of notes. It means the dilemma is artificial. The dichotomy is artificial. There's no fight there at all. And yet, traditionally, historically, we've been treating it like there's this fight between determinism and free will.
I do think that determinism versus free will is a false dichotomy. It's a red herring. Even if, in fact, we did not live in a deterministic universe, even if there was a sort of an element of fundamental randomness in our actions, then that wouldn't make our actions free of causal influences. We just make them random. When I get up and go to the refrigerator to get some beer because I'm thirsty, I don't think of that as a random action at all. Now, it's possible that there are some quantum random effects at the level of the brain. Nobody's ever measured them, and I think it would be really difficult to measure them. But it's supposed that they are, because after all, the brain is in fact a physical system. Okay, so that only means that occasionally I will do something random that I can't explain, that I'm not gonna be able to give you a causal account of. And it's like I just rolled the dice, my brain just rolled the dice. But that's not what we mean by free will. We mean the ability of actually making deliberate choices, or reflecting on things and then making a choice about certain things.
The thing about free will is that if you ask people if they have it, they'll say they do. And that's because we experience free will. We know what it feels like. Even though we don't have it, there's this illusion of free will. And I think the reason for that is because although we don't get to choose what we want, we get to do what we want. And so we still have this experience of free will because you are choosing to do what you want. You are making that choice. That's something you're doing. It's just that you couldn't have gone any other way. It's like John Locke's analogy of a man in a locked bedroom. He's carried in sleeping, he wakes up and there's a person next to him who he likes to talk to, is a good conversational partner. So he decides to stay in the room. He doesn't know the door is locked. Now, the point of the analogy is that although he chose, this man, he chose to stay in the room, clearly that was his choice. But what he didn't know was that he couldn't have done any other way. The door was locked, he just didn't know it. In the same way that the man is ignorant of the locked door and so felt like he had the choice, we're ignorant of causality and the philosophy surrounding free will, and so we feel like we have free will.
If you realize that your behaviors come from your brain and your brain is made of matter and matter obeys the laws of physics, then everything that emanates from your brain, which includes your choices and decisions and everything else that you do, is the result of the laws of physics and has to obey the laws of physics. Since those laws are by and large deterministic, then your behaviors and choices are deterministic.
Every event has a cause, and the link between the cause and the event is a function of the laws of physics, whatever they turn out to be.
Now, insofar as they're not purely deterministic, that is, they obey to some extent quantum mechanical indeterminacy, then that still doesn't give you libertarian free will, because the movement of an electron in your brain is not something you have control over. So whatever happens in your brain, it's not something that you have any control over.
Our minds are what our brains are doing. We know this because every time the brain gets influenced in some way, the mind changes, whether it's by drugs or surgery. That's not up for debate anymore. So if we accept that we're a part of the universe and the universe is deterministic in the way it evolves, then our behavior is determined in the same way that everything else in the natural universe is determined.
That's what made me become a hard determinist. That's all you need to know. If you believe in the laws of physics and that they apply everywhere, then you instantly have to become a determinist.
I'm what's called a hard incompatibilist. I think that free will is both incompatible with the truth of determinism, because determinism excludes the ability to do otherwise, what's often called leeway incompatibilism. It also is incompatible with the agent being the ultimate source of their actions, which is sometimes called source incompatibilism. But I would argue that indeterminacy provides no avenue really for free will, because agents are no more in control of indeterminate events than they would be for determined events. So whether the universe is deterministic or indeterministic, I maintain that we would still lack free will.
Any indeterministic event that happens can't be up to the chooser. It can't be something that is a willed event.
We don't control how the atoms swerve. And freedom involves not just indeterminacy, but also control.
There's no way that an immaterial soul, which is what it actually is envisioned with free will, that there's some kind of homunculus that's not physical, that is controlling the physicality, that can interact with your brain.
That is profoundly counterintuitive for many people, that the reasons that they are the way they are totally uncaused by them, and that if you try to explain why, if you just keep asking why, like a child, why are you this way, why are you that way, why are you good at this, why are you good at that, you will hit an explanatory dead end, or you'll hit an explanation at a level that is something that you did not cause and could not possibly have caused.
So why am I not a compatibilist? And you can make this vivid by a manipulation argument. You can imagine a manipulator is really sophisticated, so that the manipulator manipulates me to perform an action, but doesn't violate my reason's responsiveness. Suppose I'm Joe, the tax evader again, and I've got egoistic reasons to evade taxes. I've got moral reasons to refrain from evading taxes. So a manipulator might want to see to it that I'll evade those taxes. So he might have me controlled by a system which allows him to kind of ramp up the level of self-interest or egoism as a result of neural intervention. And suppose he ramps up the level of egoism so that I inevitably evade taxes. Now, under these circumstances, I still might be reasons responsive, because it might be the case that if the reasons were different, I would have behaved differently. But intuitively, I'm not morally responsible. And I think this manipulation scenario isn't in principle different from a naturalistic deterministic scenario. Right? They're in principle exactly the same.
To me, the compatibilist philosophy begins with the conclusion. The compatibilist wants there to be some concept of moral ought. They want there to be moral responsibility. And they want that because they recognize that it's, or they think, they're convinced that it's necessary for practicality. Of course, this isn't true of all compatibilists, but I think that the compatibilist philosophy is largely based on wishful thinking.
The free will that these people suggest don't give people the kind of agency that they think they have. Or when you ask the average person, what do you mean by free will? It's not a compatibilist form of free will. It's only philosophers that will give you that kind of definition.
It's a semantic shift, meaning it's a redefinition of the traditional view of free will.
And it's dangerous because it lets people be comfortable with the thought that they have free will, while at the same time they're ignoring this enormous problem of determinism of human behavior, which has so many ramifications for how we want to structure society. And without thinking about determinism, then you don't think about those problems. You just sit there complacently saying, yeah, I have free will after all, and isn't that wonderful?
If we didn't have free will, but I'd say if that were really true, it would mean human beings couldn't even formulate moral principles because they couldn't help anything. So I think the human race wouldn't last long.
There is some evidence that simply reading a paragraph or two that says we don't have free will raises the level of doing a simple cheat on a test.
What they did was they created two groups of people randomly, a control group and an experimental group. And they gave the two groups a test to take, like a math test. And they told the people in the two groups to mark their own test, and for every answer that they get right, they get $1. They first gave an article to one of the groups to read, an article that disputes free will, that argues against the existence of free will. It turns out that that group cheated more on the test and on marking the tests than the other group. So that's the problem with not having free will. People will naturally be less ethical if they don't believe they have full self-control.
There's a study out there that's the cheating study that says that when people are told that they don't have free will, they cheat more. But replications of that study didn't hold to the replication. So there's certain problems with some of these studies.
So if we don't have free will, can we still be morally responsible? So the key question is this: is all moral responsibility desert involving? I think that the answer is no, because there are aspects to our practice of holding people morally responsible that don't invoke desert.
There's no reason to think that judgments about what is good and bad, right and wrong, have to go out the window if we give up basic desert moral responsibility. So we could still say that what the serial killer does is bad. Those kind of axiological judgments do not require free will, do not require basic desert moral responsibility. There are different ways to interpret responsibility. Some of these include answerability. You could say that an individual has engaged in a certain set of actions, and you request an explanation for why they acted in that particular way.
Suppose your child behaves badly, and you want to call your child to account for behaving badly. Now, one reason to call him for account, to blame him, is to give him what he deserves. He deserves to be blamed. Another reason to call him to account is to see to it that his character gets formed in the right way. So you might want to morally educate your child. So we have a backward-looking notion of blameworthiness, and we have a forward-looking notion of blameworthiness. The forward-looking notion of blameworthiness survives the demise of free will.
There are three main positions one can take on free will: libertarianism, compatibilism, and free will skepticism. Libertarians believe we have free will and that determinism and free will are incompatible with each other. Compatibilists believe we have free will and that free will is consistent with a deterministic world. Free will skepticism encompasses all positions that conclude humans do not have free will. It includes both hard determinism and hard incompatibilism. Hard determinists believe we cannot have free will because the world is deterministic. However, the modern free will skeptics known as hard incompatibilists add that an indeterministic world has no room for free will either. So when it comes to the question of whether humans have free will, the libertarians and compatibilists say yes, but the hard incompatibilists say no. But what if reality is truly deterministic? Would that be a threat to free will? The libertarians say yes, the compatibilists say no, and the hard incompatibilists say it's irrelevant. In a world where humans are governed by laws of physics and chemistry, how exactly would contra-causal freedom work? And what are the consequences of living in a world without a belief in free will? Such questions may motivate free will believers to develop frameworks for how they think free will can work. To answer this question, we turn to philosopher Robert Kane.
If I'm to be responsible for my action, and my action flows from my character, then if I'm to be responsible for my action, I have to be responsible for my character. Well, you know automatically what that's going to mean. That's going to mean it's going to get you into the problem of a regress, right? You have to keep going backwards and backwards if you're responsible for anything that led you to this, right? So the question, in my view, is how do you stop it, right? And my feeling is somewhere along the line in our lives, there must be what I call self-forming actions, right? And these are points in life when our will is divided. Using an example like Finwagons about the fellow who was thinking of stealing from the poor box in the church. He knows nobody's in the church in the afternoon, so he can do it. But he's really wondering whether he should take it away from people who are just as bad off as he is, since it is a poor box after all. And he reasons about this and he thinks about this. He's divided. This conflict in the will stirs up indeterminism in your neural processes, so that when you're finally going to decide one or the other, it's not going to be determined, because there's an indeterminacy in your brain itself. In such a situation, whichever thing you choose, you're going to have to make an effort in order to overcome the resistant motives on the other side. Whichever one succeeds, he will have done it voluntarily, intentionally, so on, by having made an effort and succeeded in that effort. Now, each of those efforts would have been undetermined, and they might have failed, but their failure would have just meant that the deliberation went on until maybe he went to the other one, or he did it again at a later time. Or they may mean in the end that the deliberation terminates without a decision being made.
Obviously, though, the concern here would be, what role is the agent playing in settling which of those two outcomes? It doesn't seem that the agent has the control needed in this situation to settle. And in fact, if you were to roll back time and have those same events unfold over again, if true indeterminacy exists at the quantum level, you would get a different outcome. Now, Kane would say, well, if the outcome differs, you still are responsible because you had reasons supporting that outcome. You had reasons for acting in that way, and you willed it. Now, some people are convinced that that's enough, but I'm not. I feel like that kind of an account lacks the control needed for an agent to be able to settle the outcome, to explain why that outcome rather than another outcome. And the quantum story can't really provide that kind of counterfactual explanation as to why this happened in this instance rather than that.
We have the image in our mind that if there are some undetermined events in this effort I am making, in order to control that effort, which is an activity that takes time and involves many, many neurons, if I'm to control that, I gotta crawl down to where the indeterminism is in the individual neurons and control each one of them. And we can't do that. But we never do that. There could be, in our thinking right now, some indeterminacies we don't control, and yet we can control the larger processes of which they are a part.
It may really be the only way that you could really have causal chains beginning in the brain is if it pops out of nowhere, as if it's completely random. And people often think that this is some kind of escape of free will, because people conflate the idea of there being no free will with determinism. Because oftentimes they're compared, of course they are. And so you're thinking about determinism, the view that the entire universe is determined by prior causes, and you say, well, aha, what if there's randomness in the brain? But take a step back and realize that, of course, by definition, if something is random, you're not in control of it either. There's just no room for free will in this entire structure of philosophy and science.
I don't believe there's any such thing as randomness in the universe. Now, why would I say that? Physicists argue that you can't predict the path of a particular particle because we don't know enough, or the process of measuring it would move it, so it'd mess up your measurements. Okay, I have no problem with that, but particles are still not random. If particles really were random, then there'd be no systematic cause and effect relationships in the universe. So the particles in an ice cream could turn into a rubber tire, but they don't. They don't ever. So you can't think of anything in the universe as being random. So human beings have a nature. Part of that nature is a certain kind of consciousness which has the power to focus at the conceptual level, to bring your mind up from sense perception to the level of thought. So that's causal, but it's a form of causality that you don't see in mechanistic systems. But it's not a contradiction of causality, but it's a form of causality.
Now, agent causal libertarians could preserve the control and action that's needed to ground basic desert moral responsibility, because they posit the notion of an agent who is more than just a conglomeration of physical events. The agent can't be reduced down to brain chemistry, to neurons firing. The agent on this account is a sui generis kind of causal agent that is able to be an uncaused cause, to cause their actions, but themselves be uncaused. But the problem there is that agent causal libertarianism fails to fit with our best physical and philosophical and scientific theories about the world. An agent who is the cause of their actions but themselves uncaused attributes a kind of godlike ability to an individual, that they could basically create actions ex nihilo, cut off from all their antecedent factors. This kind of conception of agency suffers from our notion of causation to begin with.
Causality is one of those phrases like free will that needs to be carefully defined. There's this one wrong idea that it's worth getting rid of right away, which is that either the world is governed by cause and effect, or anything goes, like anything, just random events should be happening. And clearly that's not true. Clearly it's not anything goes, therefore it must be governed by cause and effect. But that's not at all true. Cause and effect is a very specific way of thinking about the chain of events that happen in the world. It's a useful way on our human scale, right? Where you move your arm and you knock something off the table, it falls down, you say, oh, that thing fell down because I bumped into it with my arm. But that becomes a less appropriate way to talk when you're talking about fundamental physics. So there's a question, what is going on at the fundamental level? And the answer is the laws of physics. The answer is a pattern given to us by equations like the Schrödinger equation or Einstein's equation or whatever. Words like cause and effect are nowhere to be found in that vocabulary, but there's still an unbreakable pattern, the laws of nature, the laws of physics. So it's certainly not anything goes. It's just that you need a much more modern, updated vocabulary to talk about what does go. If the laws of physics were indeterministic, that means you couldn't predict what will happen next, but it doesn't mean you have some contra-causal influence over what happens next. It doesn't give you any libertarian free will. In some version of quantum mechanics where wave functions collapse spontaneously, it's not my volition that is making them collapse. And likewise, if I'm a compatibilist about free will, if I say that free will emerges at the macroscopic level, then it has nothing to do whether the microscopic laws are deterministic or not.
For people who are dualists or libertarian free wills, who envision a form of free will that is independent of the physicality of your brain, yeah, that is a battle, and you got to choose one way or the other.
A lot of these scientific tests that address neuroscience and how the brain works, they're fascinating. They tell us a lot about the brain. They tell us that the brain is functioning at many levels, not just at the conscious level, however you define consciousness, but also functioning at lower subconscious or unconscious levels as well. And for example, they do show that many of our decisions are made before we are consciously aware of them.
The classic study was the Benjamin Libet study, which was done in 1983, which basically showed that you had about 350 milliseconds before a person was even consciously aware of their intention to make an action. And so that sort of concept has been looked at with more modern technology.
The way they do it is they give people 2 buttons to press. They have a screen that the person looks at that allows them to denote what time they feel that they consciously decided which button they'll press.
And they were told that whenever they had the will or desire to push this button, to just record when it occurred on the clock. And what they found is about 200 milliseconds prior to pushing the button, individuals become aware of an intention to push the button.
You would see this, what he called a readiness potential, which is like a sort of building up of brain activation about 350 milliseconds before they feel the intention to move. And then it takes about another 200 milliseconds to actually make the movement.
And what it indicated to some is that the brain has already begun the process that will ultimately lead to the action before the individual has decided to push the button.
They can actually read the scan, and before the person realizes they're consciously aware of which button they'll press, they'll know which button they press with a certain degree of probability that's higher than chance, basically.
And these studies have come up with the same thing. So in one study, Itzhak-Fried looked at, you can actually just measure activation of individual cells when you're going into someone's brain, for example, to track where their epileptic seizure is coming from. And you can look at brain activation that way. They found the same thing. You get this precursor before you're even aware of your own intention. John Dylan Haynes, who's done work in Berlin using fMRI, showed that you could predict up to 10 seconds before a person is consciously aware of their intention, for example, whether they're going to go left or right, by basically decoding brain activation.
Not in real time. The analysis takes too much time. These are retrodictions, but they're scientific predictions, because independently of knowing what the subject did, you can say, I predict that when we look at the data, we'll find that the subject moved the left finger, say.
This throws into question the existence of free will, because if our decisions are being made before we are even consciously making them, then what is making them? Something impersonal seems to be making them.
What is the readiness potential? Is it really a choice before a choice? Or is it like where there is this rehearsal? Whenever we're thinking about we might do something or we might not do something, we rehearse it first. And might the readiness potential just be a rehearsal?
To form an intention can take time. And it can be back and forth, and you can change your mind, you can cogitate.
If I ask you to flick your wrist or say boo at some random point in the next 30 seconds, how do you go about doing that? You don't know. At some point you'll say boo or you'll flick your wrist. But how did you make that happen, and how did you keep from making it coincide with something going on? You don't know. Well, in fact, apparently what you do is when you're asked to do something like that, some subterranean process gets triggered in your brain and it chugs along a little bit, and you find yourself saying boo or raising your finger.
You can think of it like a sort of lots of noise happening in the brain, and occasionally some of it rises above a certain threshold, or you notice it when it's before the threshold, and then you kind of enhance it till it gets to a point where you have the intention itself.
And it turns out that if you've got data from brain scanning of that process, and you tweak it just right with a deep learning algorithm, you can tease out the information and say, this person is going to say boo, or is going to say left or right, going to push the left button or the right button.
There's been some controversy with this readiness potential with Benjamin Libet, because they're saying, well, it's not that the brain is sort of gearing up to make a decision, but you're having all these random kind of patterns or sort of waves of activation. And at some point, especially if you're internally focused and waiting for a feeling or a cue to get you to move, because that's what they were doing in that study. They said, when you get the feeling, make a move. So you're actually focusing your attention inward, sort of looking at those internal, naturally occurring fluctuations. And when one rises a bit above the rest, then you sort of notice that and push it forward and say, I have an intention now. But all of this is that the brain activation is occurring and the thoughts are coming sort of after the fact, or maybe even simultaneously, but not before.
I have refuted the Libet studies in my book. They don't prove anything like a lack of free will. And I can make a lot of points, but I'll make just the essential point. The Libet experiment starts with a conscious decision, which is the purpose assigned by the experimenter to bend your wrist. Okay, so that's the starting point, without which there'd be no Libet studies. Okay, they didn't bring him into the lab and say, they had a purpose.
No, if you're doing experiments on trees or rocks, you don't have to whisper in the laboratory. No matter what you say in the presence of a rock or a tree, it's not going to affect the experiment. But it does in the case of a human being. Well, what's going on there is that human beings are, by that very fact, demonstrating their free will, their capacity to be counter-suggestive, to be obstreperous, to resist manipulation, and it is built into the scientific method in the human subjects, in the human sciences, that you have to guard against this. You have to go to great lengths to neutralize the autonomy of the subjects. autonomy is real. How they can then think that it isn't is, I think, a really interesting question.
Then at the end of all this, they said, well, do you have any choice? And he said, yeah, you can choose not to respond. Well, wait a minute. So you have free will to respond, but you don't have free will not to respond, but that's a choice. So that's a contradiction. How can you have no free will to choose to do it, and then you have free will to choose not to do it? That's a choice. So the whole thing is a mess. So I don't buy any of that stuff.
Oh, so you want me to press the button when I have the urge to press the button? Is that what you want? And the experimenter said, yes, that's what I want you to do. I want you to freely press that button when you have the urge. See, that's a poorly designed experiment. Why? Because free will is being able to do something that your urges don't want you to do. Right? You have an urge to do something. Free will is the ability not to do what your urges tell you to do. That's what free will is all about. So that experiment is not testing free will, it's testing something else.
Some people try to argue for free will by saying, well, maybe we have free won't. Like maybe in between the period between which we have the intention and before we actually do the action, we have the capacity to sort of stop ourselves.
Free won't, which I think is a very, very nice phrase for the whole idea. But the veto thing is rather controversial.
Patrick Haggard has this study called There Is No Free Won't, where they show that there's precursors in terms of brain activation to our decision to inhibit a behavior as well. So you can't get around this cycle.
Compatibilists would just say, well, that's just consistent with the idea that our actions are causally determined, and as long as they're determined by agents that involve certain kinds of mental activity, there's enough free will to hang your hat on. I don't think it's going to change the traditional line that compatibilists would take. It might be more troubling for libertarians, however, if you want to impart to the agent a kind of libertarian control or agency that intervenes at a point, a kind of top-down causation where the agent is able to cause various neural processes that will ultimately lead to action. If this finding indicates, and it holds up, that the brain states actually initiate the action prior to the conscious awareness, it leaves little room for that kind of libertarian free will to enter the picture.
There is no material thought without activation of the brain. So first comes brain, then comes thought or subjective experience. So subjective experience either is the brain's actions, or it's a product of the brain's actions, or it's a product of the sort of calculations that are happening in the brain. But you can't have thought first, because people often say, well, where does a thought begin? Where is the origin of a thought? And it's just basically, there's a lot of random firing in the brain. It's always on, it's always moving. And at some point, a certain type of interaction creates a thought. And then that thought can have an effect on another thought, but they're all based on underlying brain activation.
It could very well be the case that the way the brain works is that something goes on unconsciously before it actually becomes conscious. That's the way the physical body works. I don't have a problem with that at all. But that doesn't negate the possibility that there's a non-physical free will that we have.
If you say an immaterial mind does it just like Kant said a noumenal self does it, the question is how? And that's the old problem of interaction, right? Of mind and body, which has always been the problem.
That sort of view would put us outside of nature. Now, is it plausible that we're outside of nature? Well, maybe, if dualism is true.
René Descartes famously was a libertarian who believed in mind-body dualism.
Descartes believed that there's the physical universe on the one hand, and there are also minds, and minds aren't in the physical world. So you might believe that minds aren't in the physical world, and they're not governed by any sort of law, whether that law be probabilistic or deterministic. However, we're physical agents, and at a certain point there has to be interaction between the decisions that the mind makes and the body. If the mind isn't governed by any law at all, and the body is governed by laws, say deterministic laws, I think we're going to see violations of the deterministic laws at that interface between mind and body. We could, in principle, discover anomalies, maybe violations of the natural laws at the interface of mind and body. Are we going to find those anomalies? I think people haven't found those anomalies yet, but at least it's subject to an empirical test.
You know, at any time in the development of physics, we think that there are certain things we can safely predict and certain things we can't. You know, once Newton had figured out the laws of gravity, we could predict what was going to happen in the solar system to a pretty good approximation. These days, we have quantum field theory, we have what we call the standard model of particle physics, which is the theory of electrons and quarks and electromagnetism and the nuclear forces and all that stuff. And we also have Einstein's general theory of relativity, which is our theory of gravity that works not only in the solar system, but also in the expansion of the universe, for example. Together, these are called the core theory, the quantum field theoretic version of the standard model of particle physics plus general relativity. It doesn't work when gravity becomes really strong. It doesn't work for black holes or for the Big Bang. But in our everyday lives, it works. And as far as we can tell, in fact, we have very good evidence it's true, the core theory governs absolutely everything in your everyday experience. So anything that you personally have ever seen with your eyes, touched with your fingers, etc., is completely compatible with the predictions of the core theory. And we have very good arguments, again, that say that if there were anything outside the core theory that could possibly have an influence on you as a biological organism obeying the laws of physics, we would have noticed it by now. We know how to make new particles, new forces, new phenomena that could couple to us, interact with us strongly enough to matter for our everyday lives. We've looked for them and they're not there. So as far as the fundamental laws of physics governing our everyday lives are concerned, we're done. We have those figured out. The new laws of physics, which will absolutely be necessary, are necessary for the cosmic view, for when gravity becomes very important, for when energies become very high, not for our everyday lives.
Reduction is a good thing at an operational level. Science works in a reductionist way for good reasons, meaning that we have a complex problem and what we're going to do, where we're going to break it down into pieces and we're going to try to figure out the individual pieces, which is easier, and then hopefully we're going to be able to put together those pieces in a coherent whole. That's how science works ever since at least Descartes, and it's obviously worked very well. But that's a methodological kind of reductionism. It's not a metaphysical version. It's not a strong reductionism of any kind. Strong emergence is defined as the appearance of truly novel behavior once that systems become complex enough or interact in a complex enough fashion.
It's hard for me to explain strong and weak emergence because to me, emergence is weak emergence. That's what I mean by emergence. Even though I love emergence and I use it all the time, I love the weak form of it. And the weak form of it is basically saying there's another way of talking about things at the higher level, but there's not something there at the higher level that is completely different and incompatible from what was going on at the lower level. Roughly speaking, the idea of weak emergence is, in principle, I could take what happens at the lower level, put it on a computer, give it the laws of physics, simulate what's going to happen, go back up to the higher level, and that's the same thing that would happen in the higher level itself. Strong emergence says, I can't even use a perfectly powerful computer to simulate what would happen because the higher level is just intrinsically different. There's something that emerges that can't be reduced down to stuff going on at the lower level.
In my theory, I look at human beings through dynamic systems theory, which is a theory about how various complex systems in the world operate. I think of the self here as an information responsive, complex dynamical system. And dynamical systems are now well known in nature. And they are systems in which higher levels of complexity make the system capable of exerting certain kinds of constraints on their parts, including the atoms, so that the complexity here actually can have downwards causation. I definitely believe in downwards causation in this sense.
Is there a downward causation? I would say yes. Your thought process can change your brain, even though that requires a brain. I think there's a famous person who treats obsessive compulsive disorder, and he's done experiments on this, and he says he'll train people to think about their obsession in a certain way as a way of treating themselves. He goes back and records their brain has changed. So yes, I'd say there's downward causation. Now, how that works, I have no clue, but I believe it does have to work.
Downward causation is one of these concepts that gets involved a lot when you talk about strong emergence. The idea that there are things that are going on that need a higher level description to be captured, and they affect what's happening even at the lower level. Personally, I don't think there is any such thing as downward causation. Examples that are typically given are if you want to understand how certain molecules of water get arranged into a snowflake, you have to understand the higher level 6-dimensional hexagonal symmetry of the snowflake. I think that's simply false. If all I knew were the fundamental laws of physics, that water molecule would obey the fundamental laws of physics. It might be convenient, it might be extraordinarily explanatory for me to say it's part of a snowflake, but if I were Laplace's demon and just knew what every molecule was doing, I would predict that snowflake just as well without any new stuff. So I don't think that in the real world, as we currently understand it, there's any reason to believe in strong emergence or downward causation.
My answer is I have no idea. I have no idea how it works. It's a very unusual thing in the world. The brain is the most complex entity maybe that ever existed. Consciousness is somehow dependent but different. And they could discover, well, here's how the brain gets into the state where you can be conscious. I don't think that's known yet. And there's no contradiction there. But it's got to be an emergent property.
I think that it's really important to appreciate what it would mean to have emergence that was more than just weak emergence. Because if I have the laws of physics as I think we understand them in the core theory, and I believe that you are made of a collection of atoms and forces, then that theory makes predictions for what you're going to do. And the question is, do you think those predictions are correct or not? Those are the only two options, right? I think that those are the only two options here. If you think those predictions are correct, then there's no such thing as strong emergence. There's no such thing as libertarian free will. You just admitted that you obey the laws of physics. If you think those predictions are incorrect, then you're saying that the laws of physics that we use to describe particles and forces are wrong somehow. So tell me how they're wrong. That sounds really, really hard to do. One of the features that we've learned about physics is that you can't just mess with the fundamental dynamical laws. Once you break them a little bit, they tend to go completely to pot. So it's much harder than a lot of non-physicists appreciate to just say, well, there's something at the higher level that creeps in that is not there at the lower level of particle physics. That's a really big burden to meet.
When we talk about free will, we're really talking about conscious intention. Because if I say to you, your unconscious has free will, your brain is deciding, you're the last to know about it, nobody likes that concept of free will. They're looking for that conscious feeling of I actually am the master of my own decisions.
I think the problem with libertarian free will is that it involves a misunderstanding of causation. Take a coin flip. It's our very paradigm of a random event, but of course it's caused. But it's caused by factors which include the location of every atom and electron in the visible universe. Many events in a deterministic world are chaotic. they're not controllable and they aren't controlled, and it's wrong to think you can identify the cause. So I think what the libertarians are confusing is thinking that their wills can't be free if their wills are part of the causal fabric of the universe. But no, that just doesn't follow. In a deterministic universe, some things are determined to be chaotic, some things are determined to be self-controlled, some to be remote-controlled. But if you are determined to be self-controlled, then you're self-controlled. And that's what you would want. Your fervent wish should be that your brain should be caused by the information streaming into it to make the decisions that you, given your needs and desires and wants and quirks, most want to serve your purposes. What could be freer than that?
Compatibilists redefine free will as self-control, for instance. Philosopher Harry Frankfurt does this. He comes up with this notion of first-order desires and second-order desires, where my first-order desire is to eat this cookie right now, but I have a second-order desire to, say, lose weight. And if my second-order desire wins out over the first one, then that's me exercising my free will. Of course, that just pushes the question back, what determined my second-order desire, right? That doesn't get you out of the problem. That just leads you to an infinite regress where you're positing a 1000th order desire by now that is itself explicable in terms of causes that you didn't have control over.
If determinism is true, our actions are inevitable as a result of factors beyond our control. And how could I deserve blame or punishment for them?
Dennett thinks that compatibilism consists of the fact that we're immensely complex in our mentation, so that we have to take in a number of different inputs before we give an output, which is our decision or our behavior. And somehow, according to Dan, this constitutes free will. He's never specified what level of complexity it has to be. Chess-playing computers can do pretty much what a human does. They take in an enormous number of inputs and they do these complicated calculations about, well, what would happen if you did that? The same thing that humans do. And in fact, these computers are pretty much doing what humans do. And they do it better than humans because they can beat most humans now. But nobody says that these computers have free will. So I'm curious as to why Dan thinks that a complex nexus between inputs and outputs in a brain that's evolved to be complex constitutes some kind of agency.
There is a socially constructed notion of free will, which is just as real as, say, dollars. Notice that we had to start off with gold and silver as our coinage. It had to be something that people felt had intrinsic value. It doesn't have any particular intrinsic value. And we've learned now that you don't have to have gold, you don't have to have silver, you don't even have to have dollar bills. Way over 99% of all the money in the world is simply virtual money. It's on your credit card, and it's an information. It doesn't have any particular physical presence. It can be in any form you like. Does that mean that people should abandon money or that money isn't real? No, money is real. It's a social construction. And the rules regarding it are very, very potent and very important. Very few people would want to do without it. The same thing is true of free will. I like to think of it as its membership in the Moral Agents Club. The Moral Agents Club is a social artifact. It's something we've created. We've created it for very good reasons, even if we haven't understood what those reasons were. It's what permits us to live in security. So what we do is we set up moral presumptions and rules and make it very clear to our fellow human beings. You want to be a member of the Moral Agents Club? Here are the rules. And if you don't obey the rules, you're going to be punished. And we will not consider the fact that you were determined to do that as an excusing condition, because it isn't. excusing conditions are about specific defects of causation, not causation in general.
Let me start by saying compatibilists have done a lot of good work, I think, on identifying different capacities of agents that give them different degrees of autonomy or control. I think these are very important distinctions, but I think they're important in a different place than the compatibilists. I don't think these distinctions are enough to ground belief in free will and belief in basic desert moral responsibility.
A common theme among free will skeptics is to say that nobody ever deserves any punishment. And I say, well, what about red cards in soccer or penalty boxes in hockey or flagrant fouls in basketball? Are we going to get rid of all of that? Because after all, nobody deserves anything and nobody could help. No. The rationale for those rules is clear and ubiquitously understood. Well, punishment for breaking the civil laws is the same sort of thing.
Without the assumption, at least, of free will, we cannot justify our moral judgments. We can't say, you are a bad person and need to be incarcerated. Or we can't say, we're giving you this award for philanthropy because of the great things you did that you didn't have to do. We assume when a criminal does something bad, they could have done otherwise. And they should have done otherwise, but they didn't, and so they are morally culpable.
One of the fears people have about free will skepticism is that it will lead to nihilism or despair. People fear that we won't be able to address criminal behavior, that we're just going to let criminals run free, or that morality would be completely destroyed. According to free will skeptics, if an individual commits a murder, they've done something wrong. We have no problem still maintaining an axiological judgment of goodness and badness, to be able to say certain actions are good and other actions are bad. Those kinds of moral judgments are not predicated on desert, are not predicated on free will. What you would have to give up if you adopt free will skepticism is the belief that individuals justly deserve blame and praise and punishment and reward in this very particular sense, this backward-looking sense.
There's no need to have a concept of basic desert if you have a concept of good enough practical desert. I compare that to being a basic mammal. A basic mammal had a mammal for a mother. Well, unless there have been an infinity of mammals, that means that there aren't any mammals. Some mammals back in the old days didn't have mammals for mothers. Well, then, were they really mammals? Well, they weren't basic mammals. Adults with responsibility evolve, grow, are educated from beings that don't have basic desert or basic responsibility. Small children don't have basic free will. They grow into it.
I think these distinctions are relevant, however, for addressing the concerns about criminal incapacitation and rehabilitation. Because an individual who is reasons responsive will be an individual you deal with differently than an individual who's not reasons responsive. So for example, on my model, if a woman were to, say, leave a child in a car with the windows rolled up and the child were to die because of heat exposure, one of the things we would have to determine at the trial was this an accident? Was this a once-off oversight on the part of the individual? Or was this a premeditated murder to be staged to look like an accident? If the individual accidentally left their child in the car, let's say last night they had a stomach flu and they were up all night and they were sick, they got no sleep, and this morning was a very important meeting that the individual couldn't miss. And they dropped off their first older child at school, but forgot the infant that fell asleep in the back car. And they later discovered that the infant had been in the car and had died due to heat exposure. That individual may not be any future risk, but that's not the end of the story. We have to figure out, for example, do they have a habitual character? where they are negligent. If they're an individual who habitually exhibits negligent behavior, well, maybe they pose a risk to their other child. Maybe then the other child should be removed, and maybe incapacitation isn't warranted in this particular case. If, however, this was a premeditated murder, if there was an intent, if there was a mens rea, an intent to do harm, and the individual was reasons responsive and meets the levels of capacities that are required by the law and that compatibilists point to, I think that indicates a different level of threat. It doesn't, in my view, indicate a different level of desert, a different level of blameworthiness. It doesn't establish moral responsibility in a basic desert sense. But what it does establish, on my mind, is that the individual should be dealt with differently than someone who accidentally left their child in the car.
In response to the free will skeptics, I must say that I am not as sanguine about it as some people like Derk Pereboom and Caruso are, and other free will skeptics. I'm not as sanguine as they are about how everything would be fine. I think there would be problems. Because if we are interested in curtailing the evildoers of this world, whether they be dictators or Wall Street people who cheat people or whatever, if we are ever going to be capable of curbing the evildoers of the world, it is not going to be by telling them they are not ultimately responsible for being the way they are. Because if we tell them that, they're going to say something like, oh, yeah, I know I work down here on Wall Street and I cheat people all the time, but that's the way I am. I'm not responsible. That's what they're going to say. My real problem with free will skepticism is precisely that one.
If you take in seriously the fact that free will is not contra-causal, the two major consequences would be that it makes no sense to talk about punishment, and it also makes no sense to talk about honors or rewards or something like that, except insofar as to change other people's behaviors, right? I think it would still be a good idea, let's say, to put people in jail in order to restrain them from doing harm to other people. It would still make sense to make people go through rehabilitation programs, for instance. And on the other side of the spectrum, it would still make sense to give medals to people, let's say, if in fact it turns out that incentivizes certain kinds of behaviors that we want to incentivize. But the whole notion of taking credit or blame for one's actions would go out the window. And I don't think that would be a bad idea.
I think morality can exist on the position of no free will. It's the moral responsibility that doesn't exist. So these are two different terms that people often conflate.
If we think of free will as the control and action required for desert involving moral responsibility, then what disappears is desert.
We can learn about what's right and what's wrong, but we can't backward blame when people do wrong. So this is the distinction between causal ethics or causal morality and just desert moral responsibility, which we don't have.
When one blames one's spouse, say, for behaving badly, one's concern might not be to give the spouse what he deserves, but rather to begin a process of reconciliation in the relationship. I need to make the relationship better.
So we have to understand that there's a distinction between just desert moral responsibility and morality in general.
The practice of holding people morally responsible has these forward-looking aspects which don't involve the notion of desert. So if desert goes by the wayside because we don't have free will, these forward-looking aspects can nevertheless remain.
Really, from Christianity on, in sort of in theological terms, and then in secular terms from Kant on, we have a particular understanding of morality. Moral philosophy and morality mean a particular thing, and basically they mean essentially the study of right and wrong. and therefore the study of moral responsibility. But there are different ways of thinking about morality and ethics. The ancient Greek and Romans didn't think about it that way. The word ethics comes from the Greek word ethos, which simply means character. And so it was related to the kind of life you want to live. For the ancients, ethics was the study of how to live your life. It didn't have anything to do with moral responsibility as understood today. It had nothing to do with, right or wrong or things like that. It had to do with the question of, well, how are you going to be happy as a human being? What kind of life is worth living, the eudaimonic life, the life worth living. So if you take ethics and morality to be concerned with the good human life, those are the kinds of behaviors that make human beings flourish.
We don't need to believe that humans stand outside the stream of causality in order to care about the difference between suffering, misery on the one hand, and happiness and flourishing on the other.
If someone has trouble controlling their impulses, maybe punishment will deter them. Maybe it'll help them gain more constraint, and they need that external influence to help them more. But some people who just have really brain damage or very severe psychiatric illness can't even control their behavior, even with the negative or with punishers. And in that sense, how we deal with retribution is a bigger question.
The Supreme Court has indicated in the U.S. versus Grayson case that free will is a presumption of the law, that it's a foundational cornerstone, and that the claim that individuals are morally accountable and therefore justifiably punishable for crimes is predicated on a notion of free will. This is core to a certain conception of the law, which is called retributive punishment.
I think the most challenging issue for the acceptance of the no free will view in the area of criminal justice is the strength and prevalence of people's retributive intuitions.
So here's a good example of a retributive policy that I think ends up being counterproductive. In the UK, they had a movement called the Ban the Book movement in prison. They wanted to prevent individuals from sending books to prisoners. And the justification was a kind of retributive one, that these are criminals, they deserve to suffer for their actions, they don't deserve luxuries like books or education provided by the state. And so let's deprive them of certain luxuries, let them be punished, let them stew in their guilt. Luckily, this went to the High Court in the UK, and the High Court struck it down on the grounds that, well, isn't this counterproductive to rehabilitation? We want individuals to come out of prison better than they went in. And by preventing them from access to programs that would make them better, that would give them skills, that would provide them with an education, we are essentially creating a cycle of recidivism where we put individuals in cages, we treat them inhumanely for a period of time, we deprive them of mental health services and drug treatment, and then we release them and we expect that they be model citizens. We know that this is not working. We have enough empirical data to know that this is not effective.
So what do we do about dangerous criminals? So in the view I propose, it's legitimate, or it's sometimes legitimate, to preventatively detain dangerous criminals, not on the basis of the deterrence justification, but on the basis of the right to self-defense, society's right to defend itself.
So let's say I get on a plane and I'm traveling across the world and I contract Ebola. I've done nothing morally wrong. I don't deserve to be punished. I don't deserve retribution. It's not justified to take my liberty away on retributive grounds. I've done nothing morally wrong. But society would generally agree that we are justified in quarantining this individual on the grounds of public safety. The justification for quarantine would be a justification grounded in the right of self-defense and protection of harm to others.
So similarly, even if criminals are not responsible for being dangerous, don't deserve blame and punishment for being dangerous, nonetheless, on analogy with the carrier of the dangerous disease, it might be least in certain cases, legitimate for society to preventively detain them on the basis of the right to self-defense.
The primary focus of the criminal justice system should be rehabilitation and reintegration. And we do have to take into consideration the well-being of those that we incarcerate. We have a moral duty to rehabilitate, and we have a moral duty to then reintegrate those individuals back into society. We have no justification for dehumanizing them. We have no justification for treating them more cruelly than is necessary to protect public safety.
Punishment has to be on the basis of sequestration from society, deterrence of others, and reformation of the person who committed the act. What you can't have in the new justice system is retributive punishment. You need a sort of empirical-based system. I mean, basically, it's a scientifically based justice system, I'd call for, in which you determine what forms of treatment people need to get people reformed, if they can be reformed, and to get them back into society. Because I think most people agree that if a criminal can be restored to society and be a productive member of society, they should be.
Norway, for example, has adopted a model where the primary focus of the criminal justice system is reintegration and rehabilitation. And they have a principle that I adopt that I think is important, and I include it in my public health quarantine model. It's the principle of normalcy. You want the conditions in prison to resemble as best as possible the conditions which individuals are going to go back to. This will make the seamless move from incarceration back into civilization far more seamless.
We're just starting to get to a place where we're integrating neuroscience into the courtroom. I've been asked a few times to be an expert witness talking about cognitive neuroscience in different cases, but it's, you know, there are pluses and minuses with it. You can use the neuroscientific data in ways that are not appropriate. You could use it to your advantage. I mean, everybody is going to have differences in their brain, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's an excuse for, let's say, murder. If you tell me somebody is a mass murderer, I don't have to look at their brain. There's something abnormal there. And that is then a question of the justice system of how much they're going to punish that person. But then you have these really amazing cases where there was a case study that was written up of a man who developed pedophilia.
This person who had up to that point behaved perfectly normally a normal citizen, a family, etc., started downloading child pornography.
And then he was going to get put away because he was living with his young stepdaughter and sent away to jail. And then he started getting these severe headaches, and then they did a scan and they found that he had a huge tumor in his prefrontal cortex.
Essentially, one of the areas of the brain that is in charge of decision-making, high-level decision-making, and the suppression of urges and things like that. Once that was found out, the person was operated, the urges disappeared, and of course he was not convicted because we found out the underlying cause. Interestingly, a few years later, he felt the urges coming back, and this time he went straight to his neurosurgeon, and the neurosurgeon found out that the tumor was coming back. They just eliminated it immediately, and he was fine.
So, how responsible was this man for his actions, right? So when it's something blatantly obvious like that, then yes, I think that's important to bring that information to a courtroom. But when you're getting to the more subtleties of the brain and the mind, it gets trickier. And so I think, you have to be careful. I think it could be very helpful in the courtroom, but it could cause problems as well.
In that particular case, the court system readily agreed that there was no sense in which we could punish the person for the behavior, because in a very important sense he was not responsible for that behavior. Well, that goes for all behaviors, not just for the ones that are induced by tumors.
Free will is not all or nothing. It can't be, and that's another reason why I'm very suspicious of some of these extra factor theories. If you have a immaterial ego that can intervene in the physical order, it does it or it doesn't. Is there any degree? Where's the degree come in? And I think free will, if you put it into the physical world, the world we live in, with all the influences on us, even if they're not completely determining, our parents, our upbringing, our genes, our brain, and so on, everything and how it operates, there's tremendous limits. And that's where I would kind of concede to the Perebooms and the others who are free will skeptics and say, yes, I think we are way too retributive in our society. And I would cut back that too, even on my libertarian view. Because if you say libertarian view is something that has to be within the natural order and not something, that comes from outside, then you've got to be aware people's upbringings are so different.
I get this argument a lot. Well, people will say, well, Jerry, you say that this comes from determinism, but I, as a humane person, even if I believe in free will, would say that we do the same thing. The difference, I think, is that determinism leads almost automatically to that view, that this is what you need to do, the criminal justice system. You don't need to count on somebody to have certain views that align with yours in order to do that. You just have to have them accept the fact that criminals are human beings that have behaved because of their environment and their genes. So to me, determinism makes it much more urgent to reform the justice system than simply somebody of goodwill thinking, how can we be more humane about things?
What is it that most people feel that they possess in regards to decision-making abilities? If the universe is deterministic, we couldn't have done otherwise. Where the clash between the free will skeptic and the compatibilist happens is how appropriate is the definition of free will that the compatibilist is using, and how appropriate is the definition that the free will skeptic is using. The free will skeptic says the compatibilist definitions aren't appropriate for the free will debate.
So the incompatibilists do have a point, because if a strict determinist like myself insists on using the phrase free will, isn't it ambiguous? Isn't the average person going to think, well, you've opened the door to something libertarian? And so it's ambiguous and it's a slippery slope. So stop using the word free will.
It may be that the term free will has just outlived its usefulness. It's so embattled. There are so many different arguments which just terminate in semantic wrangles.
Yes, it is, in a sense, confusing. I mean, if you talk to general folks who believe in what philosophers would call contra-causal free will, and you tell them, no, really, things are actually work as the compatibilists say, yes, people will be confused, and people will think that, well, now you just destroyed free will. And in a sense, you destroyed the free part.
I would put in its place something like moral competence, which admits of degrees and is morally important and is compatible with everything we know with science, and then discard the debates about other senses of free will, which are like the old debate about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
I prefer to use the word volition. But really volition refers to the notion that there is some kind of conscious deliberation involved. Part of the web of cause and effect that is leading to your decisions is internal. And what we mean by this is your decision is precisely that part of that decision-making process happens inside you, mostly in your brain. And that's the only sense in which we're saying that it is your decision, as opposed to somebody else's decision, as opposed to my television's decision, or whatever.
If we should read in the New York Times that scientists have proven, that determinism is true, I'd have to do some heavy thinking. If that headline ever appeared in the New York Times and I knew I had to give up, my libertarian view, I said I'd do it. I'd feel, I don't know, I would feel that something had been lost in the world. It would be taking something away from us, I believe, that I at least, and I think many, many other people, want to believe. But you have to go, it has to be consistent with science. I feel strongly about that.
I believe it's quite possible to live consistently as a free will skeptic. Now, that doesn't mean in my everyday interactions with people, I don't sometimes feel certain types of reactive attitudes. But I could also see that those reactive attitudes within myself, feelings of resignation and moral anger, which emerge kind of naturally when someone you love is harmed, those come naturally to individuals. But I could also realize on a calmer, more reflective moment that those reactions lack any justificatory power. And I definitely can disavow them of any power in policy arguments. I could see that my personal strike back emotions, which might come naturally for many, especially in the West, that those do not have the power to justify retributive policy when it comes to criminal justice or legal reform. So I believe that it is possible for individuals to successfully live without the belief in free will, and it's possible for individuals to guide their actions in ways where they don't feel the kind of moral anger that's quite often corrosive to our interpersonal relationships and to our social policies.
Two words alone cannot capture the depth of the human experience. Although the idea of free will may have been historically useful, ideas from philosophy and modern science refute its traditional conceptions. And while the majority of modern philosophers continue to use the term, their free will lacks what many typically think true freedom requires. Since we can never act outside of physical laws, how can we develop a consistent and humane approach to dealing with human behavior? One of humanity's greatest challenges is to incorporate this knowledge into our understanding of morality, responsibility, and criminal justice.